It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. With me today, Conservative MP Matt Warman, Green Party co-leader Carla Denyer, editor of the Nottingham Post Natalie Fay, and the Daily Mail's deputy political editor John Stevens. Today, can war in Ukraine be averted?
The stakes are very high, and this is a very dangerous moment.
We have already increased the presence in the eastern part of the alliance. With more troops, with battle groups.
The Foreign Secretary talks tough in Moscow, but Russia denies it's planning an invasion. So what's going on? Also today.
At number 10, the Prime Minister and officials broke lockdown laws. Brazen excuses were dreamed up.
A former Conservative Prime Minister criticises the current one. Can Boris Johnson move on from Partygate? The Metropolitan Police Commissioner speaks out after calls for her to quit.
I have absolutely no intention of going.
3, 2, 1.
And why is cider the latest front in the culture war? Well, you heard John Major, the former Conservative Prime Minister there in the headlines criticising Boris Johnson. He's been making a speech at the Institute for Government about trust in democracy and standards in public life. Let's have a listen.
Day after day, the public was asked to believe the unbelievable. Ministers were sent out to defend the indefensible, making themselves look gullible or foolish as they did so. Collectively, this has made the government look distinctly shifty, which has consequences that go far beyond political unpopularity.
Matt, are you one of those defending the indefensible in the way John Major outlined?
Well, I hope not. I think I've been on your show a few times. I don't think that I have done that. What I do think is that this is John Major saying something that he has said repeatedly. It dates back to, I think, Brexit and maybe before that as well. So that there isn't anything new here.
So he's not worth listening to?
I'd never say he's not worth listening to. What I would say, though, is he was a Prime Minister who served, I think, with genuine distinction. I think if he thinks back to when he was Prime Minister and he had one of his predecessors doing what he's doing today on the day that the Prime Minister is in Ukraine, I'm not sure he would have taken a very positive view of that approach.
Do you think he should stay silent?
No, of course, but I think it is important that statesmen choose their moments, and I'm not sure that this is the moment I would have chosen if I'm in his position. But who am I to speak for him?
Well, Carla, on that point, and there's no doubt that John Major is a serial critic of Boris Johnson, how much notice should people pay of what he says?
Well, I have to say I agree with John Major on this, which isn't something I say often. But this is about much more than just, well, I say just, this is about much more than the parties. This is about a Prime Minister and a Conservative Party who just don't care about the rules. They think that different rules apply to them, and that's a problem. As Caroline Lucas, my fellow Green, said just last week, yes, there's a rotten apple at the top of the Conservative Party, but the whole tree is a problem. And really, to solve that, we need to go to the root. Our whole political system breeds politicians like that, and that's the problem. You know, we're one of the few countries, we're one of only 2 countries left in Europe that still uses first past the post, for example. The other is Belarus, literally a corrupt dictatorship.
All right, well, on that, John, do you want to answer that particular criticism? It's not just the rotten apple at the top, but the whole Conservative tree is rotten.
I mean, just as a starting point, I mean, comparing us to Belarus because we've got a system of first past the post seems a slightly extreme argument. But as Matt said, you know, A lot of the speech from John Major today was basically him stating what he said before. It was basically an anthology of his previous criticisms of Boris Johnson. He talked about foreign aid, he talked about prorogation, he talked about the Northern Ireland Protocol. And I think there's a slight problem that if you're a former Prime Minister who just pops up all the time, then people are going to stop listening to you. You know, we had that with Tony Blair during the Brexit rows. It used to be quite a thing if a former Prime Minister got up and stood up and said something, but Tony Blair was popping up every other week, and so people started to stop listening.
Natalie, what's your view?
Well, I mean, it's very convenient for John Major to pop up now, and anyone of a certain age, probably around my age, will remember the sleaze that absolutely rocked his government when he was in power. I mean, the scandals just went on and on and on. We had David Mellor, Norman Lamont, and I think that was the first time in a way that people properly realised politicians are human and they're flawed. And, you know, in a way, I think that's what some people, not all of them, like about Boris Johnson. He is a human, he's flawed, he's made mistakes. So maybe he is like John Major in that way, and they've got more in common than they think. But there is definitely a kind of mood coming out now that people, especially among my readers, for example, feel like we need to move on from this. And will they listen to John Major or pay attention to it? Not really sure. You know, we've got rising energy prices, national insurance, jobs, NHS waiting lists. I think now it's time for the government to sort of say, right, we need to sort these things out, or maybe not the government, someone else, someone needs to sort them out. And John Major is just sort of this kind of, is like an irrelevant sideline, really, I would say, even though it was a good speech. But is it important to normal people? I don't think so. Carla?
Well, the government certainly does need to address those issues, and I think currently it isn't doing so, partly because it's so distracted by image management with all of these problems that the Prime Minister keeps creating for them. And so I do think he needs to go, but it's also important to recognise that just changing the person at the top doesn't usually fix things. We need to go to the root to fix the problem.
Well, one of the big and critical issues that the Prime Minister says he is trying to deal with is, of course, the issue with Ukraine. The BBC's political editor, Laura Kunsberg, is in Brussels, where Boris Johnson has been holding a press conference with Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary-General of NATO. Laura, we've just been hearing John Major criticising Boris Johnson about the Downing Street parties, and that issue rumbles on. But the Prime Minister's focus today is on the situation in Ukraine. What's happening?
Yes, Jo, and hi from NATO headquarters, huge sort of cavernous building on the outskirts of Brussels, where the Prime Minister has just given a press conference alongside the NATO chief. And both men had a very, very grim message that we are in a very dangerous moment as Russia continues to build up troops on the very eastern fringe of Europe. Clearly, the issue of Ukraine is of enormous concern, and there is a lot of diplomatic conversation taking place. Liz Truss and Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, are both in Moscow today as well. In terms of specifics, well, Boris Johnson has announced that the UK would offer an extra 1,000 troops in the event of the worst happening, and there being some kind of humanitarian crisis, some very strong need if indeed there is a conflict. But this whole thing is extremely perplexing for the West because nobody can be quite sure what Vladimir Putin actually plans to do. And one official here at NATO said to me this morning they thought this situation, it could just go on, and it could just go on with the West continually trying to guess what the Russian leader's true aim of all of this is, if indeed there is an aim beyond dangling danger and threat to unsettle the West.
Right, and we've just looking at pictures of Boris Johnson arriving at that press briefing with Jens Stoltenberg, greeting each other, of course, in that COVID-secure way of fist bumping. The other politician that is also coming into Brussels is Keir Starmer, the Labour leader. What's the significance of that?
Yeah, it's interesting, Jo, this, and it is purely coincidental that the two main British political leaders happen to both be here on the same day. I think Keir Starmer's purpose of coming here is twofold, very obviously twofold, in fact. On the one hand, I think, like many political leaders, he's deeply worried about what's going on in Ukraine, and he wanted, therefore, to have his own meeting and his own encounter with the NATO chief and to make clear that the main opposition party in the UK is with the government in terms of its belief that this situation is serious and its belief that the UK should do as much as it possibly can to help support NATO and to offer its support to Ukraine. The second and much more political aim of this visit, though, is also absolutely crystal clear, is that Keir Starmer wants to signal again to the political establishment, to his party and to the public that he is not Jeremy Corbyn. Now, our viewers will remember one of the issues that Jeremy Corbyn cared a lot about was trying to prevent war in almost, all of its forms. In fact, by chance, he's addressing a Stop the War back in London rally tonight. But he was often criticised by people in the Labour Party as well as outside for never giving his full-throated support to NATO, being a critic of the Western Defence Alliance. Keir Starmer is here to say very clearly things are different under him, that he backs NATO, and he's going to try and sort of weave a historic thread, reminding people that actually it was Labour leaders like Ernest Bevin who were very involved in putting together the critical Western Defence Alliance many decades ago. So it'll be interesting to see exactly how he explains his mission here. We'll be talking to him a bit later on, in fact, and bits of that interview will be on the BBC later today.
All right, thank you, Laura Kunsberg. A busy day ahead. Carla, Boris Johnson talked up the importance of the NATO alliance as being the most successful vehicle, if you like, of protecting stability in Europe. Do you agree?
I think that diplomacy and anything that we can do towards peace is incredibly important. And to be honest, I think that the things that Boris has said in his speech today are really worrying. A lot of what he said felt more like building towards war than building towards peace.
Which bit?
When he was talking about the stakes are very high, the next few days are the most dangerous moment, that doesn't sound like sort of cooling, calming language to me. That sounds like anti-diplomacy. It's the opposite of what we need.
Matt?
I'm not sure that's right. I think if you see what the Prime Minister has tried to do, trying to corral a European voice along with NATO to provide Vladimir Putin with a diplomatic road back from where he has ended up. I think what we need to be able to show, I think, is that the strongest action Putin can take is actually to come back from the brink rather than to go over the top. And it is hard to discern what the Russians are actually playing at. But that massing of troops indicates that their intentions are only going in one direction.
Yeah, of course, I agree with you on the goal to encourage Russia to pull back, but I'm just not sure that the approach that's been taken so far. I mean, the thing about diplomacy is that, real diplomacy takes time and a lot of work. And there can be a temptation to play to the home crowd and, go in for photo ops and do a bit of flexing of muscles rather than the real kind of long haul of diplomacy. And I have to say that with the situation that Boris Johnson is in at the moment, where he's losing authority hand over fist, and also with a pretty new foreign secretary, the temptations to do that playing to the home crowd are definitely there.
Is this a distraction from troubles at home? Jens Stoltenberg himself actually praised the UK response for being robust, but picking up on Carla's criticism of the language that is being used, terrifying consequences, Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, have said. Is that the right way forward in terms of diplomacy?
Well, I think it has been helpful at home to have the Ukraine situation something that Boris Johnson can deal with. Last week we had the Sue Gray report out on Monday, and then Tuesday, surprise, surprise, Boris Johnson chose that day to go to Ukraine for meetings. But I think we can't view this all through the domestic agenda, and I think it's clear that the UK is standing up on the world stage. We sent the kind of defence resources to Ukraine and flew them when other countries weren't willing to do that. You've seen Liz Truss in Moscow today. I don't think we can say that everything they're doing is because of the concerns about Partygate. And I think the UK is actually playing quite a strong role here. But obviously there's no easy answer. There's no kind of clear way out for any of this. And obviously it is the role of the UK to say, if you do invade Ukraine, we will take harsh sanctions. And obviously there's a big concern for the government about it's not just going to be Ukraine that's affected if this happens. There are going to be a big impact at home. That's not just about fuel prices. There's concerns about misinformation campaigns in the UK. There's concerns about cyber hacking. And so I think it's obviously the role of the UK government to stand up and say, if you do invade Ukraine, this will be disastrous for both sides.
Natalie, how much or how big an issue is this, do you think, for your readers?
I would say it's probably not much of an issue for them, unfortunately, although it is important. But at the moment, there seems to be so much going on in the UK, which we sort of alluded to in this conversation, that I think people would appreciate it if the Prime Minister did start to focus on some of those issues that are affecting real people day in, day out. And, you know, there are a lot of distractions for the government, but that doesn't take away from the struggles that people are having in trying to pay their heating bills, you know, and all those sorts of things, trying to get a look in at the doctor. So when are these issues going to be sorted out? It's a question.
Matt?
Well, I think Natalie's right that the government has a lot on its plate. But for instance, you've seen very recently huge multi-billion-pound announcements on helping with energy prices. You've seen yesterday and the day before big announcements on elective recovery for the health service. So
taxes going up and leaving taxpayers with the bill for paying for that pandemic recovery, and energy bills going up by £700, with half of it perhaps being helped out by the government.
Well, as you say, significant intervention from the government on helping out with that stuff. And also, you are right to point out that this stuff does have to be paid for, ultimately.
All right, let's talk about, though, the tension at the heart of what is going on in terms of the UK government and this potential military conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Is this Russian expansionism or is it NATO expansionism?
No, I don't think it's NATO expansionism, but by any means. I think this is a sensible approach by the prime organisation that secures peace and security in the West. The Russian argument that this is some sort of aggressive move by the West simply doesn't hold water. What's important is that Ukraine, like every other country on earth, has the right to defend its own borders and to secure its own borders.
Well, that's not actually how it's seen here by Stephen Glover in the Daily Mail today. Says Vladimir Putin is a nasty piece of work. But forgive me for saying so, when it comes to Ukraine, I think he's got a point. He says it was a mistake for NATO to promise full membership to Ukraine. That was a commitment they reconfirmed last summer when Vladimir Putin is so very sensitive about anything that looks like a security threat on his border.
Well, I think the point about full membership is a process that countries can go through. What I think is wrong is to say that we should do the wrong thing by Ukraine for the sake of the sensitivities of another country. What we should be doing is trying to do the very best for a country that is facing very serious threats, as we're seeing building up day by day on its own borders.
Carla?
Well, I think regarding that Stephen Glover quote, I very much hope that that's the kind of thing that is being discussed in this diplomacy, because that's the kind of area where they should be exploring to figure out, where the sensitivities really are.
Right. Does that mean that the policy document on the Green Party website from October 2019, which called for the UK to withdraw from NATO and also end the special relationship with the US, is that still Green Party policy?
Yes, and I'm certainly no fan of NATO in the long run, but that absolutely doesn't mean that I would be saying, abolish it now. The idea is that I want to work towards a future where NATO it doesn't have such a central role
that's
in
calling
our
for
international relations.
Right, you don't think it is important as a bulwark against Russian expansionism?
In these exact negotiations, I think that it has a role, but that policy is part of our long-term policy book. So that's about what we want to work towards.
What's long-term about calling for the UK to withdraw from NATO? That sounds like right now.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't referring to a specific date. It wasn't about withdrawing next week, say.
Right. But I think, John, there is an issue here, isn't there, in terms of how best to deal with someone like Vladimir Putin. Can you understand what Stephen Glover is saying in his article here in terms of trying to avert war?
Yeah, but I think on the other side, there is an issue that if Vladimir Putin puts 100,000 troops on the border and threatens to invade, and then you say, well, we'll just do whatever you want. We'll put all these conditions on the possible joining of NATO by Ukraine. We say we won't let NATO ever join Ukraine. We'll just put a complete halt to that. If you do that, then Vladimir Putin's going to keep popping up and doing things like that. That's just rewarding bad behaviour.
Carla?
Yeah, it's a challenge, and that's why diplomacy isn't straightforward, as we were saying earlier. But I think we really have to put a check on the idea that we meet force with force. You know, arms races and building up.
Carla, but we're not meeting force with force. Where is the force that we're bringing to this situation? We're not threatening to invade Russia. We're not even putting troops in Ukraine. It's not that we're meeting force with force. That just isn't the reality of what's happening right now.
I think there's a risk of it happening. That's what I'm getting at, and I think that we have to be alive to that. That's why I'm talking about the importance of diplomacy and building towards peace has to be our first line of defence.
Just briefly, we've just heard about these tough new sanctions that have been talked about. What will they include?
So I think we're going to be, the government has said that they'll be publishing details of that today, the ability to impose those sanctions. Now, I'm not yet privy to what that will look like in detail, but we've talked before about financial sanctions and about, for instance, the Russians no longer being part of the SWIFT payment system has been talked about. Now, obviously, I can't preempt what the government's going to say, but there are a whole range of ways that we could do things that are nowhere near the sort of military intervention that Carla's talking about, but certainly have a real impact.
Let's talk about the head of the Metropolitan Police, because there have been calls for Cressida Dick to resign. Earlier in the week, you may remember that the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, effectively put her on notice, giving her days or weeks to come up with a plan to tackle the toxic culture within the force. Now, she's been on a phone-in for BBC Radio London, answering questions from callers, and particularly in response to questions over the latest scandal to dog the Metropolitan Police over shocking police WhatsApp messages from one particular police station. Let's have a listen to her response.
I am seething angry about the whole thing. I'm very glad that the 4 individuals have left. There is no place in the Met for sexism, for racism, for homophobia, for abuse of trust or for bullying. And in the last few days, I have gone out extremely strongly to my colleagues and told them enough is enough.
Natalie, listening to Cressida Dick, do you think it's time for her to go, or should she be given time to turn things around?
I absolutely think it's time for her to resign, because policing is all about trust. She's lost the trust of the population, and most specifically, she's lost the trust of women, which is absolutely devastating. We all know what happened to Sarah Everard and the absolute horrific nature of that case. We need a complete culture change at the Met, and the only way that can happen is by having a new leader in place. And I don't think that's a symbolic gesture. I think that's really important.
Right.
And if you compare it...
Yeah, no, go on.
I mean, if you compare it to somewhere like Nottinghamshire Police, which is obviously my local force, we know that they take things like this seriously, because Sue Fish, who was Deputy Chief Constable around 2016, she made misogyny a hate crime. And that sends out a message to the population and the police officers within the force that this sort of thing won't be tolerated. And we need more of that from the Met, because it's just got too much.
So Natalie thinks she should go. Do you?
I think the fact that we've got an inquiry into the handling of the Sarah Everard case, for instance, the fact that the Mayor of London has said what he's said, for me, it indicates that the Met really does have to get its act together. And speaking as an independent backbencher rather than for the government, what I would say simply is that Cressida Dick has not yet demonstrated that she can do that. She's very much on borrowed time, I think.
Right, so you're pretty close to saying it's time for her to resign.
I'm sceptical that the Met can be the force that it needs to be under this current leadership, but I don't rule out the possibility of it happening.
Carla?
Yes, unfortunately, I do think it's time for her to go now. I did recognise the benefit of having a woman at the top of the organisation, and I know that there were hopes that might change things, but I think there's been one too many scandals now and not enough evidence of action. But just as I was saying with Boris Johnson, just changing the person at the top of the tree isn't a panacea. We also need to revisit the whole principle of policing by consent. I think there needs to be a big discussion between the citizens and the police and politicians, as my Green colleague Sian Berry was saying, London mayoral candidate and London Assembly member last year. And we need to discuss, what are the tactics that actually work, and what consent do the citizens want to grasp.
I mean, she's asking for more time, Cressida Dick, John, saying that she has already led a transformation. I suppose the question there is, gosh, how bad was it before? Should she be given that time to do what is a very difficult job?
I think the problem is that we just hear her saying that she's going to commission this review, that review. We're going to start looking at it when we actually need proper change now. And I think that you know, Creswick's always quite defensive when it comes to the Met, and I think that has been good for the morale of officers. But I think at this point in time, you need someone who's really going to shake things up and really make a change. And you look at things like the Charing Cross Station report, and she talks about how some officers have left, but a lot of the officers who were involved in that are still there or have even been promoted. You look at the Stephen Port case, you know, in those killings in Barking, where questions were raised with the officers, and the officers involved who made big mistakes are still there, still in their jobs.
Right. I suppose if you change the person at the top, though, do you actually get rid of the toxic culture that she says is there?
Well, I think we need to have absolute confidence that a new person could be doing a better job, and that's why I hold back slightly from going as far as some people do, because I think no one disputes that being Commissioner is an incredibly challenging task, and the fact that she is there doing it at the moment could be an argument for giving her that time that she asks for.
All right, let's talk about this headline in Nottinghamshire Live. This is your story, Natalie. Head teacher hits back amid claims school is indoctrinating children who wrote letter condemning Prime Minister. What's it about?
So this story is about Welbeck Primary School, which is a school in the Meadows in Nottingham. It's an inner city area of Nottingham. Labour MP, Lillian Greenwood, she's great, and constituency MP. So the teachers, from my understanding, did a lesson talking about Partygate, what was said to have happened or not happened. They watched some footage from the Commons, had a bit of a whiteboard session about it. And then the pupils were urged to write letters to Lillian to pass on to Boris Johnson, asking him to resign. And there has been a bit of a backlash against this, although, you know, it's come from all different kinds of areas. It's quite worrying that I think that the teachers have kind of imposed this view on the children, because obviously it's slightly more nuanced than should the Prime Minister resign or not. There's a lot more to it than that. And I feel like within the lesson, the teachers didn't sort of ask, is there another option? Do you think people would still vote for Boris Johnson after this, despite the fact he did break the rules, although I understand it's still under investigation? So, you know, as a parent as well, I've got 2 primary school children myself. You don't often get an insight to what's being taught in lessons. And if your children are being sort of fed political views, how can you counteract that? How can you ever get any knowledge of it or sight of it? So maybe we need more transparency about what's going on in schools, or maybe they should stop teaching them, you know, politics and pushing views onto them.
Right. Oh, no, not stop teaching politics, surely. Let's talk to Jeff Barton, General Secretary of the Association of School and College Leaders. Jeff, it's one thing to encourage an interest in politics, but was it right for students to write letters calling on the Prime Minister to resign?
Well, it's going to be pretty difficult for me to comment on the specifics because, frankly, all I know is what I've seen online. But I make 2 points, I think. First of all, just in terms of the approach to teaching about politics, that's never been more important, it seems to me. And the guidance from the Department for Education and other organisations is really clear that it's quite legitimate to teach about that, but you have to remain, as a teacher, impartial. So the principle of doing that, I think, is absolutely right. I think the question here is, was there that level of impartiality? It seems to me if what you were doing is showing young people, as I think they were, news round, and then you were saying to them, what's your view on this? What would you like to say to your MP? How would you express that? What's the kind of language you would use? As someone who's a veteran English teacher, that's our stock in trade. If it goes beyond that, then quite rightly, people will have legitimate concerns. But there is a mechanism for that. Parents who are concerned should contact the head. There's a governing body that should be holding the head to account. There should be due process within the school to see whether that level of impartiality has not been sustained, it seems to me.
Right. I mean, one photograph which the school tweeted, I have to say, showed a pupil standing next to a whiteboard with the words Boris Johnson and mistrust, lies and selfish written next to it. Do you think that is teaching politics in a fair, impartial way?
Again, I want to be a little bit careful just based on that one photo, though I take your point that the school posted that, as I understand it, as part of a Democracy Week that they are holding there. It seems to me at any point, what I did as a head, what I did as a teacher, was to make sure that I was teaching young people not just the content of the subject, what is this about, but also how we express it. And if that picture is implying that that impartiality wasn't there, then my guess is that the governors will be talking to the head and the head talking to that teacher to raise questions about it. But again, let's just be careful about racing to judgment based on that one photograph.
Well, absolutely. And actually, Natalie, the school denies it's done anything wrong and said there is no teaching, as it says in inverted commas, of politics. We explain processes and structure with the children encouraged to express their thoughts. Are you satisfied by that?
Not really. I think they did probably overstep the mark a little bit, although, you know, it's impossible to know exactly what went on. But the point they make about teaching politics, democracy, that kind of thing, that is really, really important. And it's a problem in schools, actually, that they're not taught anything about the way democracy works, the way democratic functions like the court systems work. And we see that coming through into adult life. Maybe there are some journalists watching today who will sympathise with that. When we publish court stories, people think we're not supposed to be in the courtroom. And I think that goes back to the education system and kind of lack of teaching around those democratic functions. And it feels like in this lesson, they were kind of drawing on something popular that people might want to write a letter or shout about, rather than getting down to the sort of nitty-gritty of what is politics all about and what's important for you to know.
All right. I mean, Matt, listening to this, aren't teachers within their rights to encourage an interest in politics? How it develops, of course, is always difficult to predict. I mean, the head teacher of the school said this lesson was linked to the English curriculum, where children constructed letters using their skills to form arguments, assess evidence and develop their critical thinking. Nothing wrong with that.
Nothing wrong with that at all. But this does seem like, on the face of it, it's a pretty frightening failure to grasp the need for nuance, the need for impartiality from the teachers and from the school. We all want to see better political education. I've seen some fantastic examples during Democracy Week in my own constituency, but it can be done without simply saying, write a letter to your Labour MPs expressing the Labour line.
Right, where's the evidence that they did that, though? I haven't seen any.
I mean, there's a whiteboard with Boris Johnson and lies on it, and then the children were told to write their own letter.
Presumably that was children sort of, putting their hands up, saying what they thought, the teacher recording them. I just haven't seen any evidence that the teachers told them what to think, which seems to be what these oversensitive Tory MPs like Brendan Clark-Smith seems to not be able to cope with, the idea that a few 10-year-olds that aren't even in his constituency, they're in a neighbouring one, dare have their own opinions. It's ridiculous.
I don't think anyone's going to object to children writing to MPs expressing their views. That's absolutely fine. What is worrying is the implication that those views are not wholly their own views. And I think that's why the school has questions to answer.
What about parents? I mean, what about discussions that people and children have at home? What about other input, whether it's on perhaps even social media for 10 and 11-year-olds? Surely that also can lead to children coming to a conclusion themselves.
Of course, and we all want people to come to their own conclusions. The point is they should be their own conclusions.
So I looked at the national curriculum, the government's own national curriculum on this, and for this age of children, it says pupils should be taught to talk and write about their opinions, explain their views on issues that affect themselves and society, learn why and how rules and laws are made and enforced, and how to take part in making and changing the rules. This lesson sounds like a perfect example of following the government's own national curriculum on political education.
But that's all well and good, but surely the role of the teacher there was to say, some people think this, here are some ideas that people think that he has misled Parliament, he has told the truth, but there are other people in the country who think this and that, and then let the children decide. But instead they had this whiteboard with lies, myth, truth, selfish on it, and then we're told to write their letters. And when you actually read the letters that these 10-year-olds apparently wrote, I mean, they are slightly suspicious. One is talking about GDP figures and unemployment and crime being down 14% or up 14%. I mean,
they're obviously watching Politics Live.
Exactly, they're well
yesterday's PMQs, Carla.
Well, they watch Newsround. I think that's in the report, and again, that is encouraged by the government as part of political education for kids of that age.
Right. I mean, Jeff, it is difficult, isn't it, to present things completely impartially. There's always complaint on one or other side. Don't I know it? But you don't want people to be put off from talking about politics or political debate in schools.
You don't, Jo. It's never been more important that young people understand that there are things you will want to express, and you'll want to express them in particular ways. I would feel proud that young people are understanding that writing to your MP is one really legitimate way of expressing your concerns. The question here is, how far were they expressing their own views in their own language? And we, frankly, could talk endlessly about that. We won't know that, nor will we know that just based on one picture from a whiteboard, because we don't know at what point during the lesson that was taken, and whether the teacher was saying, actually, that's not not the kind of language which we would be using if we were writing to an MP or somebody else. But I think the principle of it is actually one to be welcomed.
Right. I mean, isn't there a bit of fragility around this, John, from some Conservative MPs?
I mean, possibly, but I think it's a good discussion. And I think that, you know, there is concerns if children are being kind of in these hot houses where they're just being forced opinions on them. That's not good, especially after the last few years when we've seen our country as being quite divided. It's actually quite useful to tell children there are different people in the country who have different opinions, and that is quite right, and that is part of democracy. I think that's an important lesson.
Right. Don't you think, though, Carla, that teachers and the teaching profession always get used to some extent by politicians of all stripes to sort of yield them to their way of thinking or presenting arguments?
I think it's no fun being a teacher at the moment for a variety of reasons, and being told off for doing your job is certainly one of them. Look, political and citizenship education is so important to prepare people to be active citizens in society. I was reflecting on this when I was hearing this news yesterday. I very probably wouldn't be in the role that I'm in now if it wasn't for a couple of brilliant teachers at my school who set up a debating society after school, which is incredibly rare in state schools like the one I went to. And you know, they didn't tell us what to think. We weren't being told, you know, we weren't being indoctrinated with their views, but they taught us to debate respectfully and effectively. And you know, look where that got me. So I wish I wish every kid in the country got that.
Right. I mean, do you think it's time just to let teachers teach and not interfere?
So there is a reason why there's government guidance. There is a reason why there's a national curriculum, or all of that stuff. But of course, the best schools, I think, are those that let teachers, to some extent, have their own head. They have their own opinions, and they communicate them in a way that allows people to form their own opinions. That's what's really important.
Right. Natalie, do you think the school is slightly surprised to have found itself at the centre of this sort of debate and discussion?
I absolutely do, and I feel sorry for them in a way that they've been thrown into the spotlight here, because it's not fair on the children or the teachers at the end of the day. But it does raise an important point, and it's one that we're quite rightfully talking about today, that's been debated over previous days in the media. But it's only a small school in the Meadows, and I do feel for them slightly, so hopefully it will die down soon for them. But it's something we need to talk about.
All right, Jeff, just before I let you go, do you think these rules need to be revisited or refined in any way?
I don't, to be honest, Jo. I mean, there's always a sense that teachers working in a class with 28, 29 young people may sometimes say things that are appropriate, sometimes not. I don't know what's happened in this instance. But frankly, we don't need more regulation. We don't need more guidance. We do need more support for teachers doing their very best in difficult circumstances, and more state schools doing debating societies, which is something I was so proud of, and encourages more young people to want to take their place in public life. We definitely need more of that.
Absolutely. Jeff Barton, thank you very much for that. Now, we're going to talk about something called Countering Colston, Edward Colston. This is the campaign group with a mission to decolonise Bristol. You're a councillor in Bristol, Carla. It's called for a boycott of Thatcher's cider. Now, the group claim that the company director, Martin Thatcher, is a member of the Society of Merchant Venturers, which was once actively involved in Britain's slave trade, and counts Edward Colston as a former member. This is a tweet that was sent out by the group. Did you know that Thatcher's cider is owned by a merchant venturer? The Society of Merchant Venturers is an elite private members club of which Edward Colston was a prominent member. They have been heavily responsible for the continued celebrations of the slaver in Bristol. Do you back the campaign?
Well, I like Thatcher's as much as the next Bristolian, which is to say...
I was going to say, it's pretty brave, isn't it, to take on cider?
Well, I was going to say, I like it as much as the next Bristolian, which is as much to say that I will have it if there's nothing better on tap.
Oh.
Sorry, a bit of an in-joke for Bristolians there. I really admire the work that Countering Colston have been doing. For years, they've been campaigning and raising awareness of the cult of Colston, which is really quite sinister. It celebrates a people trafficker and someone who, you know, committed and commissioned mass murder, and by really treating him like a saint. Until a few years ago, the Society of Merchant Venturers had a cabinet on display with Edward Colston's fingernail clippings and hair clippings, as if it's some kind of medieval relic. And they have been very active in trying to prevent the recontextualisation of Colston. So there was a campaign running for many years, which nearly came to fruition, of not taking the statue down, but putting a new plaque on the plinth explaining the new context.
I understand that, but are you backing this boycott?
So This boycott is about a particular individual.
I know, we've spent, and are you backing it?
I don't know enough about how involved Mark Thatcher has been in the Merchant Ventures. I understand he only joined Martin Thatcher. I don't know how involved he's been since he joined. I gather it's recent, and I don't think that's just me that doesn't know. That doesn't seem to be in the public domain. So I think my view depends on whether he's been actively involved in promoting Colston or not.
All right, so, not a completely clear answer there on that. But
let me say why.
I'll come back to you in just a moment. But John, has it gone too far, this campaign?
Well, it's not really clear what this boycott is seeking to achieve. I mean, this organisation, we know clearly it's got links with Colston in the past, but you look after the toppling of that statue of him, it said that that was right for Bristol and put out a statement saying that the only way to move forward and tackle problems like racism today is acknowledging Bristol's dark past and getting rid of references to Colston. So they seem to be campaigning against the organisation for what they did in the past rather than their current stance.
Actually, the merchant venturers still have a surprisingly large role in decisions made in the city today. So they're an unelected organisation. They're not very transparent. They don't publish minutes or anything like that. And yet they have a direct role with the council. There's a council committee called the Downs Committee, which owns a large amount of land in the city. And the merchant venturers have a direct role on that committee, which I used to sit on spending money and how green space is
But that's
run.
not what this boycott is about. This isn't a boycott calling for more transparency and something to do with land. This is a boycott about Edward Colston.
No, it is actually part of what it's about. Countering Colston are now continuing their campaign to challenge the role of the merchant venturers in the modern life of Bristol and saying, yes, given their shadowy past, but also given their continuing role now, shouldn't that be challenged?
Natalie, what's your view, listening to the debate and the discussion? Is this a group that is advocating something relatively reasonable in trying to decolonise Bristol, or has it gone too far in boycotting this particular company that makes cider?
Well, I mean, it's a great way for them to grab headlines. It's certainly caught everyone's attention today, but I don't think boycotting cider is the way forward. I think there's obviously some discussions to be had in the city of Bristol about the role this society plays and its historical links. It does seem quite worrying to me when I looked into it. And then you see pictures of the Colston Day procession, for example, full of white men walking through the centre of Bristol on a certain day to celebrate somebody in the past. I think Bristol needs to have a really proper discussion about its past, how it can come to terms with it and learn from it. And I think that society probably won't have a place in the future. Unelected people running a city is never good.
Right. I mean, retain and explain is the government's broad policy. I mean, it's not working, is it?
Well, no, I don't know if that's true. I think what we should be seeing on statues in the future is as much of an ability to both explain why they are there and explain why they were put up by a different generation, and to explain how we feel about them as a society at the moment.
I know, but it clearly hasn't worked, because that's why the statue was toppled. That's why there are campaigns like Countering Colston.
Well, I think it clearly didn't work in Bristol's case, where the local council didn't take advantage of that huge sentiment that statue should be gone. I think it was a failure of local democracy in many ways to engage properly with that. But at the broadest terms of what are we doing to tackle racism, what are we doing to achieve the aims of the Countering Colston society, the idea that you do that through boycotting cider just seems to me like you're completely missing the point.
I agree with what Natalie was saying about the need for a discussion, and in fact that's already happening in Bristol. There's a history commission, there's lots of groups working together from the community, and recently they published a publication, a report called Project Truth, which is all about engaging with communities about what should happen next, because yes, the statue is down now and in a museum, and to me that's a positive, but that doesn't solve racism. So what do we do next? And one of the calls made in that report is for a museum, a dedicated museum about Bristol's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. Cities like Liverpool that had a similar level of involvement have already done that. Cities like Liverpool also used to have these old archaic institutions, a bit like the merchant venturers, and they got rid of them decades ago. So I think that Bristol could substantially learn from what Liverpool has done, and there's still further to go.
Briefly, do you agree with that, John?
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I just don't think the way you get to that point is by boycotting cider.
All right, well, on that, cheers. I suppose it's almost lunchtime. That's all we've got time for. Thank you to all of my guests. I will be back tomorrow with Politics UK at 12:15, and then there is a recess, of course, for a week from Parliament, and we'll be back the Monday after. From all of us here, bye-bye.